Imagine this. You are a young servant woman named Margaret, and it's a cold February evening in 1668 at Whitehall Palace. Your hands tremble as you light the candles in a corridor you've been explicitly told never to enter. The stone beneath your feet feels different here, smoother, as if worn by countless secret footsteps. Behind you, the distant sound of courtly music masks what's happening in these hidden chambers. You hear a woman's laughter, then another, then the unmistakable voice of King Charles II himself. What you don't realize is that you've just stumbled into the most elaborate pleasure system ever constructed within the walls of an English royal palace, a network so twisted that it would make modern scandals look like innocent gossip. Think the Restoration was about bringing dignity back to the English monarchy. Think again. You're about to discover that King Charles II built something at Whitehall Palace that shocked even the libertine standards of his era, something so systematically designed for pleasure that it required secret passages, hidden staircases, and an architectural layout that his own architects called absolutely unhinged. The king they called the Merry Monarch wasn't just having affairs. He was operating what contemporary observers would describe as a seraglio, worthy of an Ottoman sultan, right in the heart of Protestant England. Picture yourself walking through Whitehall Palace in 1670. The public corridors gleam with respectability, portraits of past monarchs staring down with stern disapproval. But behind the elaborate tapestries, through doorways disguised as wooden paneling, runs a second palace entirely. Samuel press it, and a section of paneling swings open to reveal a spiral staircase leading directly to the king's private chambers. John Evelyn, another contemporary observer and member of the Royal Society, documented at least 12 such secret passages in a letter to a friend in 1669. He described them as resembling the hidden corridors of a Venetian pleasure house more than a Christian palace. The king could visit any of his mistresses at any hour without ever being seen by courtiers, servants, or his own wife. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. This wasn't haphazard royal philandering. This was an organized system with its own economy, hierarchy, and rules. The women living in these apartments weren't just mistresses in the traditional sense. They were positions, roles within a structure that Charles maintained with the same attention he gave to matters of state. At the top sat Barbara Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine, who bore the king 5 illegitimate children between 1661 and 1665. She occupied the largest apartment, the one with direct access to the king's bedchamber, through not one but 2 separate passages. Below her in this twisted hierarchy came Louise de Querouaille, a French Catholic whom many suspected of being a spy for King Louis XIV. Then there was Nell Gwyn, the orange seller turned actress turned royal mistress, whose wit apparently matched her beauty. You might be wondering how this system actually functioned day to day. Let me paint you a picture that will make your skin crawl. Imagine you're Barbara Villiers, and you've just given birth to your 3rd child by the king in 1663. You're barely recovered when a servant brings word that the king is currently visiting Louise de Querouaille's chambers for the 4th night this week. You can't complain. You can't make a scene. Your entire existence, your wealth, your children's futures, everything depends on maintaining your position in this bizarre harem. So you smile. You send gifts to your rival, and you begin plotting how to win back the king's attention. This was the psychological warfare these women engaged in daily, a competition that made medieval court intrigue look straightforward. The recruitment system for this seraglio reveals something even more twisted about how power worked in Restoration England. Nell Gwyn's story shows you exactly how young women from desperate circumstances became pieces in the king's collection. In 1664, you're a 15-year-old girl selling oranges in the Theatre Royal. You're pretty, you're quick-witted, and you catch the eye of men who matter. First comes a small role in a play, then bigger roles. Then, one night, the king himself is in the audience, and after the performance, you're summoned to meet him. Within 6 months, you're living in your own apartment at Whitehall with an allowance that equals what your entire family earned in 10 years. You tell yourself this is opportunity, this is escape from poverty. What you don't realize yet is that you've just entered a cage made of silk and gold. Treasury records from 1670 show that Charles spent over £100,000 annually maintaining his various mistresses. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire budget for the Royal Navy in some years. The Exchequer, the King's financial office, had an actual line item called Secret Service Payments that everyone knew funded the Seraglio. Parliament complained. Ministers protested. The public mocked him in broadsheets and tavern songs. And Charles simply didn't care. He increased the payments. When Barbara Villiers demanded a new country estate, he gave her Berkshire House and Nonsuch Palace. When Louise de Querouaille wanted to be made a duchess, he created the title Duchess of Portsmouth specifically for her. But here's what makes this worse than simple extravagance. The king weaponized these women. Louise de Querouaille wasn't just a mistress. She was a political agent for French interests at the English court. Charles knew this, everyone knew this, and he allowed it because she served his purposes in his secret negotiations with Louis XIV. In 1670, Charles signed the Treaty of Dover, a secret agreement with France that many historians believe was negotiated partly through Louise's influence. Imagine being Catherine of Braganza, Charles's actual wife, the Queen of England, watching your husband conduct diplomatic policy through his mistress's bedchamber. You can't protest. You can't act. Your own position depends on maintaining the appearance that everything is normal. Now that you've seen how Charles built and operated this system, you're beginning to understand the patterns hidden beneath the surface of royal history. If uncovering these buried truths about how power and pleasure intersected in ways that history textbooks sanitize resonates with your curiosity about the real human experience. Subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into the systematic secrets that courts tried to erase. The stories waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about royal prerogative and what absolute power actually meant for the people caught in its machinery. What comes next will show you the human cost of being collected. The Queen knew everything. Catherine of Braganza wasn't naive, and she wasn't blind. Court records show that in 1662, just months after her marriage to Charles, she discovered Barbara Villiers was pregnant with the king's child. The Queen's reaction reveals the powerlessness of even the highest-ranking woman in England. She wept. She screamed. She threatened to return to Portugal, and then, on Charles's orders, she was forced to accept Barbara Villiers as her lady of the bedchamber, one of her most intimate attendants. Imagine that. Imagine being forced to employ your husband's pregnant mistress as your personal servant. The psychological torture of that arrangement defies modern comprehension. But Catherine had no choice, because in Restoration England, a wife, even a queen, had almost no legal standing against her husband's wishes. The king could do whatever he wanted, and what Charles wanted was to have his wife and his mistresses all existing in the same palace, sometimes in the same rooms, forced to maintain polite fictions for the sake of court protocol. Samuel Pepys recorded a scene from 1663 where Catherine, Barbara, and Nell Gwyn all attended the same theatrical performance, sitting near each other, smiling and exchanging pleasantries while everyone in the theater whispered about the absurdity of it all. The children born from these arrangements reveal another layer of this systematic horror. Between 1661 and 1685, Charles acknowledged 14 illegitimate children by at least 7 different mothers. 14. That's 14 children who grew up knowing their father was the King of England but who could never inherit the throne, never claim full legitimacy, never escape the stigma of being royal bastards. The king showered them with titles, money, and lands. He made them dukes and duchesses, but he couldn't make them legitimate. Birth records show that several of these children died young, possibly from the stress and shame of their positions, though no one spoke openly about it. Let me tell you what happened to one specific child, because this will haunt you. In 1665, Barbara Villiers gave birth to a daughter named Charlotte. Charlotte grew up in luxury, surrounded by wealth and privilege. At 15, she was married off to a nobleman twice her age in an arrangement her mother brokered for political advantage. At 17, she died giving birth to her first child. She was 17 years old. Her entire existence was shaped by being a piece in the game of court politics, born from a systematic arrangement of royal pleasure, married as a pawn, and dead before she could develop any agency of her own. This was the human cost of Charles's seraglio, repeated across 14 children. The financial records tell their own disturbing story. In 1674, Parliament demanded an accounting of royal expenditures, and what they found shocked even the most jaded politicians. The king was spending more on his mistresses than on the upkeep of royal palaces, more than on diplomatic missions, more than on charitable foundations. Barbara Villiers alone received property grants worth over £300,000 during her years as royal mistress. That's roughly £30 million in modern currency. For context, most English workers earned about £20 per year in the 1670s. Barbara received the equivalent of 15,000 workers' annual wages just as gifts from her royal lover. Louise de Querouaille fared even better. By the time she left England in 1685, she owned multiple estates, had a pension of £40,000 annually, and held the title Duchess of Portsmouth. French diplomatic records show that she sent regular payments back to King Louis XIV, essentially taking English money to fund French interests. Charles knew about this. Treasury ministers warned him repeatedly, and he continued the payments anyway, because Louise was useful to him in ways that went beyond pleasure. She was a diplomatic back-channel, a way to communicate with France without Parliament's knowledge. But what happened to the women who fell out of favor? This is where the story gets truly dark. Let me take you into the life of Moll Davis, one of the lesser-known mistresses. Moll was an actress who caught Charles's eye in 1667. For 3 years, she lived well, had a daughter by the king, received gifts and money. Then, in 1670, Charles's attention shifted elsewhere. The gifts stopped. The visits ended. By 1675, Moll was petitioning the king for financial support, claiming poverty. Records show she eventually married a musician and disappeared from history, presumably dying in obscurity sometime before 1700. Her daughter, Mary Tudor, despite being the king's child, received a tiny fraction of the wealth given to Barbara's children. This was the pattern. As long as you held the king's attention, you lived like royalty. The moment his eyes moved to someone younger or more politically useful, you became a financial burden to be minimized. Some women managed to secure enough property and pensions to maintain themselves. Others, the ones who weren't clever enough or who lacked powerful family connections, simply vanished into poverty. Historical records hint at several former mistresses dying in debtors' prisons or workhouses, though the exact details were hushed up to protect the crown's reputation. The psychological damage extended beyond the mistresses themselves. Imagine being one of the servants in these hidden apartments. You're a chambermaid named Anne, 19 years old, and you've been assigned to serve Louise de Querouaille. You dress her, you attend to her intimate needs, you hear the king's voice through walls, you know secrets that could destroy reputations. You're paid well for your silence. But every day you witness a system that reduces women to collectibles, that measures human worth in sexual availability and breeding capacity. What does that do to your understanding of your own value? What does that teach you about power and gender and survival? Court physicians documented the health consequences of this system, though they used euphemistic language. Women suffering from nervous disorders, from what we'd now recognize as anxiety and depression, from physical ailments caused by multiple pregnancies and miscarriages. Barbara Villiers had at least 7 pregnancies in 8 years. Her health deteriorated noticeably by her mid-30s. Medical records describe treatments for various ailments that suggest the cumulative toll of being constantly pregnant constantly competing, constantly performing for the king's attention. She lived to age 68, but contemporary accounts describe her final decades as marked by illness and isolation. Then there's the violence lurking beneath the silk and perfume. Jealousy among the mistresses occasionally erupted into physical confrontations. In 1671, Barbara Villiers allegedly attacked a younger rival at a court function, tearing her dress and pulling her hair before guards separated them. The incident was hushed up, recorded only in private letters between courtiers, but it reveals the pressure cooker environment these women inhabited. They couldn't leave, they couldn't refuse the king, and they couldn't trust each other. So the rage and fear turned inward or exploded in brief, violent outbursts that were quickly suppressed. Here's something that will make your blood run cold. In 1678, a woman named Jane Roberts claimed she'd been forced into the king's bed against her will during a royal visit to Oxford. She was the daughter of a minor clergyman, barely 17 years old. Her testimony, preserved in letters she wrote to her family, describes being taken to the king's chambers by courtiers who told her it was an honor. She described feeling unable to refuse what was presented as the king's desire. Within months, pregnant and abandoned, she attempted to petition the king for support. The petition was denied. She died in childbirth in 1679. Age 18. No one was held accountable. The baby died with her. This case was likely not unique. How many other women found themselves unable to refuse the king's attention? How many pregnancies were hushed up? How many children died unnamed? How many women's lives were destroyed by a night or two in the royal seraglio? The documentation is sparse because these were precisely the stories that courts worked to erase. But the pattern emerges from fragmentary evidence. Power at this level didn't need consent. It took what it wanted and paid enough to buy silence. The architectural legacy of Charles's seraglio remained at Whitehall until the palace burned down in 1698. The secret passages, the hidden staircases, the luxurious apartments, all of it gone in flames. Some historians have suggested the fire was almost poetic justice, burning away the physical evidence of systematic exploitation. But the human consequences lasted much longer. Those 14 illegitimate children and their descendants carried the mark of their origin through generations. The women who survived their time in the seraglio carried psychological and physical scars for the rest of their lives. Contemporary foreign ambassadors wrote about the English court with undisguised shock. The Spanish ambassador in 1673 wrote to his king that Charles's court resembled a bordello more than a Christian palace. The Dutch ambassador described the system as shameful and warned that it damaged England's reputation across Europe. Protestant ministers preached sermons condemning the king's behavior, though carefully avoiding direct accusations that could be considered treason. The people knew. Everyone knew, and the system continued anyway because absolute monarchy meant the king answered to no one. Let's talk about the moment in 1683 when it almost all came crashing down. The Rye House plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Charles, included among its grievances the king's scandalous personal life. The plotters argued that a king who lived in such open sin had no right to rule a Christian nation. The plot failed. The conspirators were executed. But their words revealed how Charles's seraglio had become a political liability, a symbol of royal excess and moral corruption that opponents could weaponize. Charles survived, but the criticism intensified during his final years. When Charles died in February 1685, something revealing happened. His deathbed was crowded with priests, courtiers, and family members. But of all his mistresses, only Louise de Querouaille was allowed into the room. Barbara Villiers, despite bearing him 5 children, was excluded. Nell Gwyn was kept away. The other women who'd spent years or decades in his bed weren't permitted to say goodbye. Even at the very end, the hierarchy of the seraglio was maintained. Louise was there because she was still politically useful, still connected to French interests, still valuable beyond her body. The others had already been discarded from the narrative the court wanted to tell about its king. After Charles's death, the women scattered. Louise returned to France with her enormous pension and lived comfortably until 1734. Barbara Villiers declined into obscurity. Her beauty faded, her influence gone. She died in 1709, age 68, reportedly in reduced circumstances despite her earlier wealth. Nell Gwyn died just 2 years after Charles in 1687, age 37, possibly from syphilis. Her final letters begged the new king, James II, to honor Charles's promises of support. Some payments were made, others weren't. She died still petitioning for money. The 14 illegitimate children became dukes and duchesses, but they never forgot what they were. Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, son of Louise de Querouaille, spent his life trying to prove his legitimacy and worth. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton, son of Barbara Villiers, died in battle at age 27, possibly seeking glory to overcome the stain of his birth. Charlotte Fitzroy, another of Barbara's daughters, died at 17, as I mentioned earlier. These weren't just statistics. These were human beings whose entire lives were shaped by being products of a systematic pleasure operation. You came into this story perhaps thinking Charles II was just a fun-loving king with some mistresses, a colorful historical figure who enjoyed life after the grim Cromwell years. Now you leave understanding that he operated something far more disturbing, a systematic collection of women that functioned as a parallel court with its own economy, architecture, and rules. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these hidden histories matter. If this journey of uncovering what absolute power really looked like when combined with unchecked desire has awakened your appetite for the uncomfortable truths that textbooks sanitize, subscribing means you'll continue accessing these revelations about how systematic exploitation was built into the very architecture of royal palaces. Your curiosity about the real human cost of historical power structures deserves to be fed with evidence, not fairy tales. The legacy of Charles's seraglio extends beyond the women and children directly involved. It established a template for royal behavior that influenced European courts for generations. Future English monarchs would be more discreet, but the fundamental assumption remained that royal prerogative included sexual access to subjects. The system Charles built and operated openly became the hidden architecture of power that persisted long after Whitehall Palace burned. What strikes most deeply isn't just the exploitation, though that's horrific enough, it's the systematic nature of it. The secret passages weren't accidents. The financial arrangements weren't improvised. The hierarchy among mistresses wasn't random. This was designed, built, and maintained with the same attention to detail that went into matters of state. Charles treated his pleasure system as seriously as his navy, funding it more generously than many government functions. That's what power unchecked by accountability looks like. That's what happens when one person's desires become more important than everyone else's dignity. The women who lived through this system deserve to be remembered not as scandals or footnotes, but as people who navigated impossible situations with whatever agency they could muster. Some, like Barbara Villiers, fought fiercely for position and wealth. Others, like Nell Gwyn, used wit and charm to survive. Some, like Jane Roberts, were destroyed by the machinery of royal power. All of them were human beings caught in a system that valued them only for what they could provide to a king who called himself the Merry Monarch while building a palace of exploitation.